Dinh Chung's family always described him as a calm and serene man. He was an immigrant father who worked multiple jobs in order to achieve the American dream. Just like any other immigrant parents, providing a better life for his children was one of his priorities. Chung lifts up his Polaroid camera and snaps a photo of his 4 children. The camera prints out a small photograph of the 4 kids, sitting closely together. None of them had a smile on their face. Chung grabs a pen, flips the photograph over, and writes, "These are the last pictures. You will never be able to see these kids again," before he pulls out a gun and kills all 4 of his children. This is a pretty old case that I found. I did not find a lot of articles covering it, but I found one article written by Mimi Swartz that did a really deep dive into this case, into the history and the family dynamics of the people involved. So I'll link that article down in the bio if you guys are interested. And because of the limited articles covering this case, the majority of the information I'll be sharing today is from her article. So if I do miss any important details and you guys happen to know anything about this case, please share it with us in the comments. This seems like a lost story. I tried researching for more coverage, but aside from this article, I haven't found anything else. So before we get into the details about the murder, we have to understand the background of the Vu family and what led Chung to make his ultimate decision. Dinh Chung grew up in the northern part of Vietnam before he and his family had to migrate to the south after Vietnam was partitioned in 1954. And during the Vietnam War, he was recruited into the military serving as a helicopter pilot for the South, where he was then captured and held prisoner by the National Liberation Front. After the fall of Saigon, Chung was forced to flee the country along with other military men, and he had to leave all of his family behind. All of the men who were fighting for the South didn't have a choice. It was either they flee the country or they'd be held in prison in Vietnam or be executed. So Chung followed the footsteps of other South military men and fled to America. He was the first in his family to arrive in America, and I don't know how long exactly after, but sometime later, Chung's brother actually helped the rest of his family flee from Vietnam, and they were all reunited by the help of a few Catholic charities. Chung's parents, his wife, and his 2 daughters decided to settle in Allen Parkway Village in Houston, Texas, which was a highly dense area for a lot of Vietnamese refugees at the time. Back then, Vietnamese families were very traditional. It's a little bit better now, but men were expected to be the main income provider for the family, while the women were expected to stay at home, cook food, take care of the family, tend to the children. So when they moved to America, they still had the same family dynamic. Chung's father, his name is Kham, got straight into work and turned his own apartment into a barber shop in Allen Parkway Village. Kham was described to be a very good-natured man. He always had customers, always had people come in and out of his barber shop drinking tea, and literally they just want to hang out and gossip with him. But Chung, on the other hand, did struggle to find a job for a little bit. At first, he volunteered at St. Joseph, which was a small church nearby, and he became one of the favorite volunteers there. One of St. Joseph's social worker named Teresa Leal described Chung to be really kind, sincere, and inward. She described him to be almost too polite. He would never welcome himself to a cup of coffee unless it was offered to him, and he would always refuse to eat the free bread that the church provides for him. Chung was pretty selfless, and he was also super persistent about getting a job. He would always leave his volunteer work early for a job interview, and when rejected, he would return the next day a little bit sad, but also eager to try again for another job. And until one day, Chung returned to his volunteer work with great news, and a huge smile was on his face. He was hired to make custom doors for a company called Plywood Distributors. He was hired by a guy named Jerry Fesselmeyer. Their relationship was very pure. Chung sent Jerry a Christmas card from his family expressing his gratitude for giving him the job. But with the pressure of trying to achieve the American dream and being the only one working the house, Chung started to feel the pressure of having to make enough to support his entire family. Chung now had 2 more mouths to feed. Chung and his wife Hui had given birth to another boy and another baby girl. And that's when a friend had passed on a message to Chung telling him that there's another company that would pay him more than plywood. So Chung tried to hop on the opportunity. When Chung gave his notice to Jerry, Jerry tried to convince Chung to stay, explaining that the new company's pay would not be better compared to his current pay and his current benefits. But with the pressure of trying to make enough money for the family, Chung decided to leave the company. But unfortunately, the promise of the company did not follow through. And this is when we start to notice that Chung started to gain a pattern of going in and out of jobs. So once that company had failed, he worked in a convenience store, and then he found another job at a lumber company, but he quit after a few months. His reasons for quitting this job were not too clear, but then shortly after, he started to work in an oil field equipment company for another year. So Chung was just constantly juggling in between jobs, trying to find a way to make enough money for his family. And one day, Chung met up with a friend that still worked from plywood, and Jerry ended up hearing about the news about Chung going in and out of his jobs. So Jerry offered Chung to come back for his company to work. Chung took on the offer, but he returned to plywood almost a completely different person. A Vietnamese local magazine named Saidong had report. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm Viet, but like there's so many accents and I don't know how to read Vietnamese. But I think it's called Saidong or Sayung. They had reported that somewhere along the way of Chung's job searching, he had lost his motivation. His work history showed that he was a man who had talent in his craft. He was very good at building stuff, but he was never able to adjust to the American environment. Chung didn't fit in with his other coworkers. He would always bring his lunch to work every day and end up eating alone. His coworkers would describe him to be as someone who didn't really want to make friends, and they also stated that at first glance he looked like a normal person, but in his eyes he was always just thinking. The author of the article, Mimi Swartz, also pointed out that because Chung was a prisoner during the Vietnam War, it could be a reason why Chung had hated being told what to do. Chung would walk out of work many times when his coworkers or managers pushed him way too far. Eventually, he ended up quitting plywood, and Jerry couldn't convince him to stay, so he sent Chung off with a letter of recommendation for other jobs. Chung fell back into the hole of finding and losing jobs. He returned to one of his old jobs and then was fired the next year because he wasn't able to put in enough effort in a timely basis. That's what it was said on his little report. That was quoted in the article. But we can start to see that Chung didn't like authority. He didn't like being told what to do. And then after getting fired from Bison, Chung spent the next few years working for a furniture manufacturer in Houston Heights and left that job because he found a job that was paying $10 an hour instead of $9. And then after 2 months of working there, he was laid off. This back and forth between finding jobs, losing his job, and the stress of saving money caused Chung to turn to alcohol. He started to drink a lot more. He became easily irritable, and the $50,000 that Chung had managed to save up during his hard days at work started to decrease. Earlier, I briefly mentioned about Chung's wife. We haven't talked a lot about her yet, but her full name is Vu Lam Hui. She was described to be a tiny woman who was very shy, and she would always look slightly down as if she was bowing. She was a very timid person, and she would always keep to herself. Chung and Hui were introduced to each other by her parents, and her parents were the one who technically picked out her husband. So basically you can call it an arranged marriage. It was very common back in the days in Vietnam. Hui followed Chung when he and his family moved south of Vietnam and then later to America. So growing up in the late 1900s, the traditional Vietnamese gender roles earlier I mentioned were basically for the woman to serve the men. There was a little quote that was mentioned in the article that I thought was very interesting. Hui follows the belief of always following all the orders of the men in her house. The first man she would follow is her husband, and if her husband passes away, she would take orders from her oldest son. And if she doesn't have a son or the oldest son passes away, she will take orders from her oldest grandson. This was Hui's mindset before she got introduced to America. And this was really bad back then, and it's a little bit better now, but a lot of women in Vietnamese families are still following the traditional way of marriage, and it's really sad. So during Chung's struggle of finding a consistent job, Hui was a stay-at-home mom, but then once the family started to struggle financially, Hui had to go out and look for a job. The pay in America, it was almost impossible for one person to make enough money to raise an entire family in America. She got hired at a tailor shop where her job was to do alterations. She worked in the back room where it was mostly quiet and she was alone. And she always kept to herself, so this was a comforting job for her. Her manager noticed that she didn't bother to wear makeup or dress up and that her clothes were a little old. Her manager even sent her home with a bunch of fabric so that she could make a new outfit for herself to look presentable for the customers. Hui seemed like a very humble woman. She was just happy to be freed from the government in Vietnam. She also had a great relationship with her father-in-law and would always be happy whenever he would stop by the shop to take her out for coffee. And right after work, Hui would just go straight home. Her priority was her family. She needed to make money for the family, but she also needed to tend for the kids. It was also mentioned that Hui was a little bit afraid of her husband, Chung. She didn't like to come home late because Chung would get annoyed and yell at her on the phone if she ever did. Chung and Hui started to face a lot of marital problems, and their relationship grew pretty toxic. Hui started to take on the burden of the family's financial struggles, and Hui would often send back money to her family in Vietnam. But Chung would always complain about the amount of money that she would send back. Chung's father, Kam, passed away in 1990, and because they were all living separate at the time, Chung wanted to bring his mother to their apartment to live, but Hui didn't agree to it. And this was one of their biggest arguments. Hui stated that there was already 6 people in a 2-bedroom apartment, and adding another person would be tough for the family and just tough for space in general. So she suggested to put his mother into a nursing home. And this is an interesting fact that I learned from the article. And I'm Vietnamese, my mom is a Vietnamese immigrant. My mom would often make jokes about, "Don't put me in a nursing home. You better take care of me when I'm old. Please don't put me in a nursing home." But I didn't notice how nursing homes were so looked down upon in the Vietnamese culture. I mean, I'm not gonna put my mom in a nursing home, but I was curious as to why she kept saying it. In the Vietnamese culture, it is very family oriented. A lot of Vietnamese immigrant families and a lot of families in Vietnam tend to have a lot of families in one house. So when Hui suggested to putting Chung's mother in the nursing home, to the Vietnamese people, that was seen as abandonment. Chung's mother did end up staying at the nursing home, where she tried to commit suicide. Their entire family dynamic shifted from what was a little hardworking and happy family, turned into nights filled with Chung drinking and arguing with his wife. But there was something going right for Chung after Hui had found a job. Chung had found a job that he did actually enjoy. He was a carpenter for another furniture manufacturer. Although there was one incident where he walked out on the job because he got made fun of for his broken English, he came back, forgave the people, and actually enjoyed working there. But his drinking habits didn't improve, and that was what made Hui started to feel unhappy about their marriage. That's when Hui started to look for happiness elsewhere, in a man named Tran Van Yung. Yung and Hui had been childhood friends, but they lost contact since the war. He was described to be a man that Chung was not. He was tall and slim. He was described as a handsome man with a charm. While Hui was settling into her new life in America, Yung was serving time in prison for supplying food to the rebels. He spent a total of 5 years in prison and eventually escaped to Thailand with his wife and children in 1981, where he eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and then to Houston. When he heard the news that there was a woman in the city that also came from the same village he did, he wanted to reunite with her. This part is unclear whether who approached who first or if he knew it was Hui at the time, but eventually the two fell in love, and everyone in the small community of Houston knew about their affair. Hui got a lot of judgment from the people around her, and even from her own brother, Thuy. Even in American culture, having an affair and cheating is frowned upon. In the Vietnamese culture, it's even worse than that. It's like the worst betrayal you can have for your family. When Chung found out about the affair, he only got angrier. He started to threaten Hui and started to have really violent thoughts. And When hearing those violent threats, Hui got extremely terrified of her husband. She went to a lawyer in April of 1991 and wanted to file for a divorce and custody of the 2 youngest children. Before we get deeper into this case, we have to know about the oldest daughter. Her name was Vu Lam Hong, who renamed herself Crystal after moving to America. In 1991, she was 18 years old at the time, and she was the eldest of 4 children. She graduated from Sharpstown High School. She was ranked the 13th in her class, and she learned how to drive. She was very quiet about her problems at home and was extremely well behaved. Although growing up in a broken home, Hui and Chung managed to raise really good kids. She was very polite and smart. She never cheated on tests, always asked her teacher how their day was, always tell her teacher that her days went fine. But Chung was kind of like a tiger parent. He was extremely strict, and Crystal was already a really sheltered girl. She didn't go to dances, she didn't go to parties, she stayed at home, and all she did was schoolwork and work. So, you know, as any other girl would, Crystal had started getting into romance books. But Chung found a hidden stack in her room one day, and he didn't like it. He took it all away and told her that she was only allowed to read books that are educating. And majority of Vietnamese immigrant parents, they often believe that in order to raise good children, they have to hold an immense amount of pressure on their back, have high expectations, and to be very overprotective over their children. When Crystal got her first job at KFC, Chung would always walk to KFC, wait for her shift to be over, and then walk her home. And during the entire fallout of her mom and dad, Crystal tried helping her parents out. She suggested to her mom that she should leave the house for a week to see if her father could calm down. So that's what Hui ended up doing. Hui left for a week to be with Young. And during the time that Hui was gone, Chung called his nephew Chi. There is a lot of people involved in this case, but Chi is the son of the brother that helped Chung's family escape to the US, and unfortunately Chung's brother had passed away. Chung called Chi one day and told him that he misses him and that Chi should come and pay him a visit. Chi was concerned about his uncle's drinking problem. He knew about it, but he did end up meeting up with him. Chung started to ask Chi if he could take care of his grandmother when Chung won't be able to take care of her anymore. Chi agreed to it. He thought it was something a lot more innocent. Of course he's gonna say yes. Then he gives Chi an envelope with $500 for the payment of his parents' cemetery plot. And when it was time to leave, Chung started to cry. And this moment was very odd for Chi, because he had never seen his uncle cry, not even during the death of his own father. Back to Hui and Young. After Hui had left the house for a while, they were planning to leave to Atlanta for a reunion. The article didn't get into any details about this. I'm assuming it's a reunion with all of the students back in their hometown. And Young had told all of his friends in Atlanta that he and Hui were married. Young lied to his wife and told her that he was going to Atlanta to find a job. But then he met up with Hui and told his wife that he wanted a divorce. Although Hui was separated from her family, she did call home a couple of times. The first time Hui called, Chung picked up the phone. Chung told her that he had quit his job and threatened to kill her and her boyfriend by hiring a hitman. At the time, Chung was in the same room with her brother, Duing, and he put her brother on the phone. They told Hui that they had sent all of the money to the brother and that the brother was on Chung's side. And the next day, Hui and Chung called each other again. Chung said that the children begged him not to kill her, so he promised her if she would come home right away, he won't touch her. And Hui didn't believe him. The argument between them escalated, and Chung's threats got very violent. He threatened that he will kill the police himself and whoever that will try to come and help her. Hui begged for him to separate for the sake of their children, and Chung disagreed, saying that if they were separated, then one of them has to die. And the next day after that phone call, Chung took all 4 of his children to Kmart and let his children shop around. The girls went around and tried on new clothes, and they went up to Dad to show him their cute little clothes, and he nagged at them, saying that the clothes were too small and to get a bigger size. Chung then took his son to go buy a Polaroid camera, and on the way home from Kmart, he also stopped by for a case of beer and a .45 automatic handgun. It was stated that he told the salesman that it was for protection and asked for the nearest shooting range. When he got home, Chung got busy writing 2 letters. One was to his employer. He apologized for never meeting the owners of the company. He thanked them for allowing him to work there and told them that it was his best job that he had in America. The next note he wrote was to Hui. He says, "From now on, I return to you the freedom that you wanted, wishing you much happiness." It was dinner time, and Chung called his children to gather around the table. Dinner was served, and he took the Polaroid camera that he just bought and snapped a few pictures of his children. And then he pulled out the gun and killed all 4 of his children. The police arrived to the gruesome scene. There was an empty bottle of vodka sitting on the kitchen counter with several empty beer cans. There was food on the table, untouched, cold. Lying around the dining table were 4 children. Crystal and her little brother died trying to run away from the scene. Yen and Huyn were underneath the table. They died in each other's arms. Across the room, Chung was sitting on the floor next to the TV. He passed away from suicide. The pistol was laid out in front of him, and there was about a dozen of photographs of his children laid out on the table, in which one had a note written on the back saying, "These are the last pictures. You will never be able to see these kids again." During the funeral of the family, Hui got the most of the backlash. Everyone in the community knew about her affair and said that it was the reason why Chung ultimately decided to end his life and 4 of his children. I believe that right after this happened, Hui had cut off her relationship with Young. Hui would often stop by the apartment that was patched and repaired, and she would keep herself busy by going through her children's things. She would often visit the tiny garden that she had out in her apartment and walked around the apartment even when it was emptied. This case was so tragic. When I first read about this case, I didn't expect it to dive so deeply into the life of the dad. I did wish it dove a little deeper into the children's life, and regardless of what the father went through, and I'm saying this with a very soft heart, I feel like because my parents are Vietnamese immigrants, this case hits a little bit close to home. I could understand the pressure of the American dream and the pressure of adapting to the new environment, but the children didn't deserve to die. They could have gone to divorce. And I could be biased because I am born in the United States. For the sake of the children, divorce is okay. The children had a huge path ahead of them, and they would have been able to make both of their parents proud. But that's the case for today, and it was a really hard one for me to research. I actually haven't seen any other YouTubers covering this case unless it's in Vietnamese. But I hope to see you guys in the next video, and remember to subscribe.